We're glad you're here. Welcome to Mental Health During These Challenging Times, with our presenters being Rebecca Groh, Jack Jacobson, and Amanda Crayson. Just a welcome and a disclaimer. We understand that many of you have questions related to your personal situation or the situation of your acquaintances and loved ones. Unfortunately, at this time, our speakers will not be able to respond to any questions about diagnosis, treatment, or recommendations for specific people. We can, however, respond more generally to questions regarding the general public and typical mental health concerns. If you submit a question regarding a topic that we feel we're not able to address, we may not respond to that question, and we ask for your understanding regarding this. Just some little background information about our speakers. So Rebecca Groh is a therapist with a private practice in St. Louis. She specializes in treatment of child and adolescent anxiety, disruptive behavior disorders, and traumatic stress. She's also the author of a soon-to-be-released book, A Kid's Guide to Coronavirus. Her profession is private practice clinician at Grow Counseling and a licensed clinical social worker. Her specialty is child and adolescent anxiety disorders, disruptive behavior disorders, and traumatic stress. And below is her contact information on her website and telephone number. Next is Jack Jacobson. He is a licensed clinical social worker and a private practice in Kirkwood, Missouri, specializing in the treatment of anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorder. He is an adjunct faculty member at the Brown School of Social Work at Washington University and has worked in a multitude of practice settings, including community mental health, the Veterans Administration, and behavioral health consultation within a primary care setting. His profession is a licensed clinical social worker in a private practice in Kirkwood, Missouri. His specialty is anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorder, and below is his website and telephone number in which you can reach him. And last but not least is Amanda Crayson, who is a psychologist who uses empathy plus science to support people with cancer, survivors, caregivers, and healthcare providers. She is an associate professor in psychology at Webster University in St. Louis, as well as an active researcher and therapist in a part-time practice. With over 15 years in oncology and palliative care, she has worked in 3 hospital systems. Most recently, she was a clinical faculty member at Washington University Siteman Cancer Center. Her profession is a psychologist in practice and associate professor at Webster University. Her specialty is people and families coping with cancer and healthcare professionals, and her website and telephone number is below. Now we can move on to our speakers.
This is a lot that's going on, and there's not a lot of precedent for us to rely upon about pandemic parenting. And yet we know that when things are feeling chaotic, when things that are difficult and new are happening, the thing that we care about most is family and how to take care of our family, and especially if you're a parent, how to take care of your kids and how to sort of support them and also yourself during that process. And so what I really wanted to do with my time here today is give you guys some guide points. These are the things that, while there is not a lot of precedent for pandemics, there is a lot of evidence we have to go on about what is helpful for kids just in times of stress and what's helpful for families in times of stress. And so I've got some steps here that we can go through. So the first step, I use a lot of sort of building metaphors when I'm thinking about how do we work through this. And the first step is really to lay a strong foundation, to lay the groundwork. That includes being consistent and also managing those expectations. So I'm going to go into what that looks like and what I mean. A really important part of consistency is setting structure and routine. This makes sense, okay? It makes sense that structure and routine is really important to getting kids and families through difficult times, because if we think about our bodies and we think about the sort of natural world, it's all about rhythm and cycle. You know, the sun goes up, sun comes down, tide goes out, tide comes in, we wake, we sleep, we have hunger, and the more rhythmic we can be, the better we do. Structure and routine for kids creates some of that necessary rhythm. It helps them regulate and it helps them adapt when things are hard. And so it can be harder when things are changing to to create structure and routine. It does not have to be the same as it was. In fact, it sort of almost can't be the same. And I'm going to talk you guys through some examples of what it might look like to create structure and routine in it that is not stressful for you as a parent. But it is important to have that structure and the routine. It helps with the cycle. We want to know what day it is. But also when kids know what to expect, they're much less likely to feel anxious. They're much less likely to feel stressed. That means you're much less likely to feel anxious and stressed also. Doesn't mean that they like it, right? They might rebel against some rules or some structures, but when we're thinking about things in the context of this pandemic and sort of the concerns that people have about kids managing through that stressful environment, we really want to keep those stress responses down, and that structure and consistency and routine really help with that. So here are a couple sample schedules I put together. I have to say that I have even been sort of had like my own stress response in social media, seeing some of the calendars and schedules that have been put out by people into the world that are very rigid and intense. It does not need to be like that. But these schedules that I put together here, I want you to know, first of all, I put together with the knowledge that summer is coming. So you'll notice that I didn't put anything about schooling in there just because we're pretty close to the end of schooling, whatever that may have looked like for your family. And then the blue one, I had in my mind a little bit more an older kid who has some more autonomy, who maybe can be a little more self-reliant. So just a checklist. So today, at some point, did I sleep, eat, move? Again, this is sort of that cycle rhythm. Did I find time to be outside? We know that going outside can be really good. Even if it's just your head out the window, it can be really helpful. Did I find time to connect with friends? We do also want people to have time to connect with family. Did I learn something new, try something new, engage in some kind of an adventure or an endeavor? And then with like the mindset of a younger kid, I gave a little bit more steps, a little bit more detail. So what time am I waking up? What can I do sort of in the morning? How do we kind of move through that day? And again, it doesn't need to be rigid, but it should have some kind of a pattern or a rhythm to it. Well, managing expectations is fortunately something I think you're going to get to hear a little bit more about in some of the other presentations, but having realistic expectations for yourself while you're laying that groundwork is really important too. You should expect this to be hard because this is hard. And so if we're setting ourselves up with a mindset that somehow we should be doing great, then that's not a helpful, realistic expectation. We do want to expect that this is stressful for you, and that's okay, and you're entitled to those feelings. And the same should be true for your kids. So you might expect to see them act up a little bit more. You might expect some regression from younger kids. And when I say regression, I just mean kind of going back to seeming like they're a little bit younger, maybe talking a little bit like a baby, asking for help with things that you know that they are capable of doing. These are all within sort of the realm of normal examples or manifestations of an adjustment that someone's going through to something that's difficult. But if we can just sort of learn to expect some of this stuff, then I think it's easier to be kinder to yourself when those things occur, when the things feel hard. A second step that's really important that we know is really helpful and protective for kids is to be communicating with them effectively. And so I kind of broke what I mean by communication down into two categories. So there's the talking about coronavirus. It's really important to talk about coronavirus with your kids, regardless of how old they are. So for older kids, we don't want to assume that they already know everything or that they understand. And for younger kids, we don't want to make the mistake of assuming that they're somehow not impacted because they don't understand at your cognitive sort of adult level about what's going on. All of them need accurate and balanced information. Now, for older kids who are more apt to be getting some access to this information on their own, it's always nice to remember that you as a parent have some influence as well and can give what you know to be sort of trustworthy, reliable information. And for young kids, there are lots of resources out there about how to talk to them specifically about the things that are going on in an age appropriate level. One of the keys to doing this, regardless of the age of your child, is to give accurate information, but also balanced information. So we want to talk about the stuff that is scary. But we also want to talk about the things that we can do to help, the things that we can do to protect ourselves. And I like for it to be in that order so that we could start with the things that are difficult and also sort of end with the things that we're doing to protect ourselves. It's good to start these conversations because we don't want to just assume that kids will come to you. It's really good to model to kids that this is an okay thing to talk about because they might not be sure how to start that conversation, and they might not be sure if you want to have it with them or what exactly to say. And in that same vein of communication, it's also important to check in with kids and just ask how they're doing. Now, some kids don't give a lot of detail to those answers, and they might even kind of a response. But even just checking in to say, hey, there's a lot going on. How are you? Again, is a really good example setting for them that if there were something that was going on that was feeling hard for them, they know that they can come and talk to you about that. You can model that also by just talking in a balanced manner about your own feelings. So, I was having a pandemic moment the other day, and I was really stressed out, and I felt my heart kind of get tight and beat fast, and I just needed to go take some deep breaths because this has been kind of scary and overwhelming. And you're just setting an example there for your kids that there are words to describe these feelings. You're open to talking about it, and then also you're kind of ending with that coping and here's what we can do to sort of handle this stuff. If your kids are coming to you to talk about things that are going on in their mind, you always want to listen with empathy. So that sounds like it was really hard. I hear that you were feeling scared, or I get it that you are so mad you can't go over to your friend's house. That is actually helpful. There's a lot of science behind that. Just in and of itself, showing that somebody's feeling makes sense is like saying you as a person makes sense, and that's very calming. It's also okay for you not to have all of the answers. So if you do a great job and you model checking in with your kids about this tough stuff that's going on, they ask you a really tough question and you don't know the answer, it's completely okay to say that is a really good question and I don't know the answer, but I'm going to look that up, or I'm going to look into it, or I'm going to really think about this and I'll get back to you. You don't need to know everything. A third step that we know to be really protective and preventative of heightened stress is connection. So kids, they need some connection time. We want them to have time with their family, and you probably are having lots of time together, but we want that to be sort of on purpose, deliberate time that you're dedicating. It can be helpful if possible for it to be one-on-one time. Doesn't need to be long. It can be 2 to 10 minutes. Lots of times when I'm working with families to talk about the kind of like one-on-one time that they're spending with kids, I'm recommending 5 minutes. And there's a lot of research to show that that is good. If you're really in it for those 5 minutes, that's not a lot of time. There's lots of ways to connect with extended family. And that's really important too. So building that sense of community, that sense of like, I still have these people in my life, even if they're not in my life the way that they maybe once were, is really protective and really powerful. Same with time with friends. So FaceTime, time with friends for you, Zoom hangouts, or those cool apps that they have where you can play games or read stories or exchange ideas via an app. I think that's very exciting. And then also taking time to connect with the community. I think especially if you're feeling anxious or if your kids are feeling more scared, feeling like you can do something to be a part of a community, to be a part of an effort to help. We know that that is actually really helpful to stress and anxiety as well. It's always okay to ask for more help if you need it. This, again, is really hard, and you will be in very good company if you find it overwhelming at times and want to check in. There's lots of people out there who are available for help. Obviously, I am supportive of therapists, and there are wonderful therapists out there. getting help from friends and family who you find to be helpful and supportive is also good. But there's a lot of people out there with a lot of questions about a really new situation, and it's okay to ask for that help. And finally, although it really is sort of foundationally also, you as a parent cannot do any of the stuff that I just said if you're not taking care of yourself first. And that's really hard, I know, to find time to do. I struggle with that myself sometimes in all of sort of the juggling that we have going on right now. But caring for yourself is necessary parenting preparation. So we're hearing lots and giving lots of examples of the airline attendant who says you have to put on your mask. It's really, really true when it comes to being an effective and protective parent, because you do matter, and your coping skills set an example for your kids, but they also take care of you. And so it's really important to be figuring out ways for a couple minutes on purpose to steal away to do something, to be kind to yourself. And so with that, I happily am actually going to turn it over to some of my colleagues who are going to give you some more information about things like that. Thank you.
All right, I think that is my cue. All right, so my name is Jack Jacobson, as I was introduced before, and I specialize in anxiety and OCD. I was actually, and I'm talking as filler while I pull up my PowerPoint slide. I was actually really excited to do this because, because I like doing stuff like this, but also because this is anxiety and health anxiety, and the way that dovetails with OCD, which is another one of my specialties, is kind of something that I'm very passionate about. And while I know that my presentation isn't about health anxiety or health-based OCD, I think there's a lot of health concerns that are happening right now. And I think that that's going to make its way into my presentation a bit here. So I had to pick, because I've got about 10 minutes, I had to pick from the wide world of anxiety kind of what to present on. So I landed on the world of worry and the idea of worry, because I think the concept of worry really captures a lot of the type of anxiety that's going to be happening during the pandemic. And that can include, again, worry about future, worry about health, worry about the future, worry about so many different things. And I want to talk a little bit about that. We are anxiety in the time of COVID. And so the thing about worry and the thing about anxiety is that the problem with worry is that it's fed by this nefarious little demon called uncertainty. And uncertainty is very, very problematic. Uncertainty is problematic because it's all around us. It's all around us even when we're not in the middle of a pandemic. We just don't have crystal balls. We can't tell exactly what's going to happen at any given moment. We can't know that, well, I will or I won't be able to pay my rent next month. Or I do know that nothing bad is going to happen to me, or that I might not contract an illness, or that I may or may not catch up a coronavirus germ while I'm in the grocery store. Right? So uncertainty is all around us, even when we're not dealing with a pandemic. And unfortunately, humans do not do well with uncertainty. And that kind of seems like a no-brainer statement, but it's actually we're really, really bad with uncertainty. And we evolved in such a way that makes sense, right? As we look back and we think about evolution, it was the early human that said, I wonder if I should go get blueberries off that bush, or maybe I shouldn't. Maybe there's a saber-toothed tiger. Actually, humans and saber-toothed tigers didn't exist at the same time, but you get the point. And somebody corrected me on that earlier today, actually. And so, it was the one who was really careful and who worried that we evolved from. So worry makes a lot of sense. And worry is based on uncertainty. We don't do well with uncertainty. The role of worry, the problem with worry, is that it maintains our anxiety. Worry is interesting in that we kind of think of worry as if it's like a symptom. It's a sign that we have anxiety, or it's like I go to my doctor and I say, I've got a lot of worry. We really need to treat my worry. as if it's the same thing as saying, like I've got high blood pressure or I've got, down depressed mood, right? But worry's not like that. Worry's not a symptom in the same way that depression is, or even that fear is. Worry is actually a behavior that we engage in. And if there's anything that you take away from this presentation, it's that I would like for you to take away from this presentation is this kind of idea that worry serves a purpose. And that purpose is to try to get away from fear, to try to get away from anxiety. I'm going to walk you through that because I might be getting a little confusing. So let me go through this a little bit more in steps. So we engage in worry to try to resolve and distance ourselves from uncertainty and from the fear that comes from uncertainty. When I have a thought like I might not be able to make my rent next month, well, that comes with fear, right? Understandably so. And then we get into this problem-solving mode of trying to worry and figure it out, right? We get into this problem-solving mode of, if I could just problem-solve my way out of knowing whether or not I'm going to be able to pay my rent next month, then I'm going to be okay. I can get away from this uncertainty. I can get away from this fear, which I don't really want to have. And so we engage in this behavior. We don't think of it as a choice. And in fact, it feels almost automatic much of the time. But it is actually much more under our control than automatic thoughts like, the thought that pops up, like maybe I can't pay my rent next month. And then we engage in this other behavior to try to mitigate that, right? So it is a little bit more under our control in terms of our ability to notice that we're engaging in this behavior of worry, and then making our anxiety worse as we do that. So it's an attempt at problem solving that's sometimes helpful on a limited scale, but often becomes an unhelpful pattern of attempted avoidance, and it tends to feed itself. So again, it's not a symptom in the classic sense, but it can become that. Worry can feed into more worry, and that can feed into more anxiety and more fear. So it's this behavior. It's like a broken coping skill, this thing that we do to try to distance ourselves from uncertainty, doubt, fear. And in fact, it really is an avoidance strategy, if you think about it. We think of it, it's a very active avoidance strategy, but it's an attempt at not having the feelings that we have that we don't want to have, right? I don't want to have to feel that fear, so I'm going to do this. So I'm trying to avoid that through an active worry process. So we could look at it this way. I like this. I like little diagrams. So we have an intrusive thought about uncertainty, have an intrusive thought about, what if I catch, a germ, and what if I get sick? Or again, what if I can't pay the bills next month? Or what if I lose my job, or my employer isn't able to make it through this pandemic and we go out of business? So you have a thought that shows up, and they're somewhat automatic. We actually have very little control over what thoughts do and don't show up in our head. I could go on a tangent about that. I could spend about 10 minutes on on control over thoughts, but we have pretty good data to support that we have very little control over what does and doesn't show up in our head, and that all humans, to a large extent, experience some fairly intrusive thoughts and some fairly strange thoughts and some fairly unpleasant thoughts on a very regular basis. So we know this. We have this thought show up, this uncertain thought. And of course, when that happens, our anxiety goes up, our fear goes up, because, worrying like whether or not you get sick from a COVID-19, from the coronavirus germ and get COVID-19, that's something to actually fear, right? So it makes sense. Our anxiety goes up. Then we engage in this worry, right? Or we engage in other avoidance strategies. Maybe we wash our hands for an overly long period of time. And it's a very good idea to wash your hands right now, don't get me wrong. Or we don't leave the house even when we know it's a safe time to leave the house, like going into our backyard. Or we do other avoidance strategies. So avoidance strategies, to a degree, are important right now. But we engage in these avoidance strategies, which then feeds back into these intrusive thoughts about, I had to engage in these avoidance strategies, and therefore that legitimizes the fact that thought must have been a really significant event. And so therefore, when that thought shows up again in the future, my anxiety is more likely to go up. and therefore I'm going to engage in more worry. I'm going to try to problem solve my way out of having this fear that I don't want to have. It becomes this cycle, and then people end up worrying all throughout the night, all throughout the day, doing these things where they're just spinning their wheels. All right? So how do we deal with this, right? We have very little control over what thoughts do and don't show up in our head. And in fact, we know that when we try to force our thoughts out of our head, it's kind of like holding a beach ball under the water. It doesn't work well. In fact, the research on thought suppression is one of the most well-researched areas in psychology to date. That the more you try not to have thoughts, the worse they get. You can work with thoughts, but the more you try to force them out or try really hard not to worry, the harder it is to actually do that. If you can manage it, again, it takes a lot of resources and it takes a lot of effort. And it's like holding that beach ball under the water. And if you let go of the beach ball, the thing that happens is it pops up, right? So how do we deal with this? Well, I think first and foremost is that notice that you are worrying. So bringing attention to the fact that worry is happening is, I think, actually incredibly powerful. And I think, if I asked a lot of people who worry, you say, well, are you noticing you're worrying? They say, yeah, like I notice I'm worrying. I'm anxious all the time. But what I mean by notice that you're worrying is, I mean, bringing attention to the behavior that we're engaging in specifically and noticing it for what it is. So I like to say to people things like, notice that I'm doing worry, because it identifies it as a behavior. It identifies it as something that I'm engaging in to try to accomplish something. Because I'm engaging in this worry to try to distance myself from uncertainty, to try to run away from this fear, to try to problem solve my way out of being scared. So I say things like, notice that you're doing worry, or I'll be sitting at home. I'm noticing that I'm engaging in worry. So noticing that. And then notice that these thoughts are thoughts. So thoughts in and of themselves are just thoughts. They're just words and pictures. You can always argue the content of a thought. Like you can always say, well, it really could happen, or maybe it won't happen, or of course that's a true thought. But when you really get down to it, whether or not you engage with a thought really comes down to, well, let me back up. I'll say it this way. Thoughts are words and pictures, and is it helpful or not to actually engage with the thought, regardless of whether or not it's true or false? And so oftentimes when we're engaging in this cycle of worry, it's not typically helpful. I've never met the person who's worried their way out of their anxiety. If you ever figure that out, if you ever actually anxiety your way out of your anxiety, let me know. We'll write a book together and we'll both never have to work again. But that aside, I've never known anybody who's accomplished that, right? So noticing that thoughts are thoughts. So I'm noticing I'm doing worry. And then notice, okay, and these thoughts, these worrying thoughts, these thoughts are thoughts. They're just words and pictures. So let me notice that. Let me notice that this is happening. I know all the things I'm saying right now are much easier for me to say than to actually do when these things are happening. But we work with what we've got, right? And then try to stay present. That might look like practicing mindfulness. It might look like noticing the things that you can experience with your five senses in any given present moment. So things that you can feel, that you can see, that you can smell, that you can hear, that you can taste, that you can touch. So things that are happening in this moment, not kind of in the future in your head. And then lean into uncertainty. And this is a weird one, because essentially what this means is go ahead and feel the fear a little bit. Go ahead and feel the fear of not knowing what's going to happen, which is unpleasant, but it takes away the function of worry. So the function of worry, the purpose behind worry, is to try to not have uncertainty. And if we can lean into and go ahead and allow ourselves to say, there's no way for me to know what's going to happen right now. I'm just going to allow myself to feel whatever fear there is that comes with that knowledge, and go ahead and just be uncertain, actually takes away the purpose of worry. And again, I'm saying this as if it's an easy thing to do, and it's not. Even if we could do that, we might get sucked right back into worry, and then we might have to start over again. That's okay, because that's how human minds work. But leaning into the uncertainty takes away the purpose, takes away the function of worry. And then engage in values-based behaviors. So figure out who is it that I want to be as a person. Right? I have specific values as a person. Type of therapy that I practice, we identify values as actions or qualities of action. So I have values around being a loving and present father and husband. And so I would choose, possibly, hopefully, if I'm living according to my values, and say, now I'm going to engage in a behavior that is me being present with my wife and my daughter, right? I'm going to notice that I'm worrying. I'm going to notice, okay, and those thoughts are thoughts. I'm going to try to stay present. I'm going to be in this moment. I'm going to allow myself to feel the fear of, what's going to happen? I don't know. So I'm going to be present to that. And then I'm going to engage in the behavior of trying to be present, trying to act in loving ways towards my wife and my daughter. And then last but not least is noticing the why. I've already alluded to the fact that, worry has a function. The problem right now with a lot of the work we do around anxiety is a lot of times we have people stop doing the things that they usually do to manage their anxiety, right? Let's go ahead and put down the worry, or let's stop washing your hands so much. I work with OCD a lot, and that's one of the presentations of OCD. It's the most stereotypical one, not the most common, but still, washing your hands a lot, or, the person who has social anxiety, who avoids parties. We work with people to stop doing the things that they do to try to distance themselves from their anxiety. Right now, with COVID-19, it's probably a really bad idea if somebody's having really bad health anxiety to say, well, let's just work on you not washing your hands. Let's work on you going out to stores anyway, even if you don't have a purpose behind that visit. Let's work on you going and getting close to people. It's a really bad idea right now. And yet we want to acknowledge that continuing to do those things, like washing your hands for a really long amount of time, avoiding all people. Well, okay, let me back up. Avoiding all people that you're not related to is a good idea right now. But going out of your way to walk 100 yards from people is probably a bad idea. So long story short is I'm saying that a lot of the things that we're doing right now to manage and to act appropriately right now are things that can make anxiety worse. So I want to be aware of that. I want to encourage people to think about what is the reason why I'm washing my hands. So if somebody has health anxiety, or somebody is worried about COVID, the coronavirus germ, or coronavirus virus, right? It's not a germ, it's a virus. To think about, am I washing my hands out of fear, or am I washing my hands based on my values and the decisions that I've made for myself based on the best information that I have? And so I would encourage people to do a self-evaluation. And if they're noticing that they're doing it out of fear, well, oftentimes in the old days, we'd have people, well, maybe you should stop doing that, but that's not a good idea right now. So maybe has somebody noticed that, pay attention to the function, and then try to come back to this last slide, notice the worry, try to make space for the worry, try to stay present, and then see if we can, as much as possible, increase the amount of the pie chart of our time that we're devoting to doing that based on our values versus based on fear, right? And saying, okay, I'm going to choose to do this because of my values, not because of fear. And I feel like I've gone over my 10 minutes. So thank you very much. And I'm going to go to Amanda Grayson.
Thanks, Jack. Let me go ahead and pull this up.
Sorry, I was so long-winded.
No, you were wonderful, as always. Let me just say too, while I'm doing this here, that we will take questions as soon as I'm done here. So please feel free, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat box, and we're happy to answer questions. So let me just say thank you so much to Mariah for organizing this. And as we've talked about families, we've talked about anxiety, and now we're going to just wrap up by kind of talking about grief and loss and what that's looking like right now. So this is a poem, and I really like it. It's very similar to Jack's metaphor about thought suppression and kind of pushing the beach ball under the water. But, I think it highlights that this is written by a poet from North Carolina, but there's no controlling life. Try corralling a lightning bolt containing a tornado. Dam a stream and it will create a new channel. Resist and the tide will sweep you off your feet. Allow and grace will carry you to higher ground. The only safety lies in letting it all in. The wild and the weak. Fear, fantasies, failures, and success. When loss rips off the doors of the heart or sadness veils your vision with despair, practice becomes simply bearing the truth. and the choice to let go of your known way of being, the whole world is revealed to your new eyes. And I like this poem because it speaks to kind of this innate desire to push away what we don't like, to avoid that. You know, and that's something innate to all of us. We don't like to feel certain things. And yet, when we even push that away, we're kind of restricting our whole experience. So in talking about that, what I'm going to talk about is, let me just see if I'm going to try to switch my, give me 1 second. Here we go. Talking about how do we make room for grief and loss. And I first want to just start off with any group, just to acknowledge that we're all affected in different ways. So, you know, our employment statuses may be different. Our exposure to the virus right now might be different. Likely our social support differs. Things like financial status, food security. We all bring our own histories of mental health and our traumas into this. And then when particularly talking about loss and grief, we all have our own histories of loss and grief. But I also want to point out, we all have our histories of resilience and coping and all of that. So just acknowledge we're coming from a lot of different places. The interesting thing about grief and loss right now is this is happening at a global level. So there's really some shared experiences. Again, there's going to be individual differences and differences by communities. But there are some similarities. For most of us, the challenges of COVID happened pretty suddenly and unexpectedly. There's been a lot of talk about, you know, how quickly things happened, and even 2 weeks before kind of life, you know, we were asked to stay at home. Even 2 weeks before that, people were planning spring break trips, or were looking for time just off school to play with their friends in the neighborhood. This happened pretty unexpectedly and quite suddenly. The other thing, specific challenges of COVID, is that our losses do differ. And our losses, this is an important thing to think about with loss and grief, but the losses are cumulative. So we may have already been experiencing maybe there was some insecurity in our jobs. I have a close friend whose mother was actually in hospice with something else when the pandemic struck. And so that's really changed how she's had to experience loss and grief. But all of these things they kind of build up. Also, uncertainty, as Jack talked about, and ambiguity continue. I mean, for all of us, there's so many answers we don't know right now. Also, just there's been uneven leadership and community solidarity. Different communities, different countries, different places in the US are dealing with this in different way. And that's a challenge of what's going on. And then also just an acknowledgement that basic needs are really uncertain for many right now. You know, people that, you know, unemployment is at a really high right now. Many people don't have food to put on their tables. There's just a lot of basic suffering right now, and just to really acknowledge that. I want the American I'm a psychologist, and the American Psychological Association has been putting out some really great resources. I'll give you some more details at the end, but some great resources. And they did a little 2-minute video about grief. And I'm just going to play that for us now. So let me just pull that up here. Good.
The COVID-19 pandemic is not only a medical crisis, but a psychological one. Along with the collective anxiety, stress, and sadness comes collective loss and sorrow. Loss can shake our senses of self. Many of us will have to cope with the loss of loved ones in the midst of this pandemic. Many are also grieving their sense of safety, of social connection, of financial security. Losing a job, not having a graduation ceremony, not being able to attend a funeral, all are losses to be grieved. What we are experiencing now is a living loss, and as we move forward, people will continue to experience losses we can't yet predict. Psychologists say that in addition to grieving what is now missing from our lives, we may also grieve for the ways in which those losses affect our senses of self and personal identity. If part of who you are is defined by social interactions, what does it mean for you when you are quarantined at home? It helps to name and claim our grief. People often have a vague sense of anxiety or suffering, but putting words to those losses can help them identify ways to move forward. Psychologists recommend journaling to help with this process. Since most of us have never been through anything like this, it can help to explore how you got through another challenging transition, like a divorce or losing your job. How did you heal and recover through that process? You can likely apply some of those strategies to this situation. Social connections are still important. Psychologists encourage people to stay connected with their social support networks through phone calls, text messages, video chat, and social media. For many people, it will take time to recover from their losses. Keep checking in on friends and family members even after this period of isolation ends. Grief is natural, and most people are resilient. Though grief is difficult, it helps to recognize that it's natural and serves a purpose. Grief can help people turn inward and adjust to a new way of life without the people, places, or things they have lost. Research suggests that once a crisis has passed, most people are able to bounce back and move forward with their lives. Know that while grieving, it's normal to fluctuate between moments of sadness and mourning and moments of acceptance or even happiness. It's also important to remember that grief is temporary. The difficult feelings will pass. For more information on how to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, visit APA's Pandemic Resource page.
Let me just pull this back up for us. So as you heard there, and actually, just on that that video, it really kind of reemphasizes a lot of Rebecca and Jack had to say. The importance of connection, the importance of noticing. So these are themes that really run through grief as well. So what is grief? And so really, and the video.
Amanda,
yes,
we can still see the video. Do you have your PowerPoint up now? I'm sorry to interrupt.
I do. No. I'm so glad you did. Hold on. Yes. Thank you. I have my slides up.
I think it's because the browser is what's shared. It's not your screen. It's the app that's shared. There you go.
Do you have it now? Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So, as the video mentioned, grief really is a normal, typical reaction. Just like worry, actually anxiety or fear are more typical reactions that we feel sometimes. Same with grief. Grief is interesting because it's one of the emotions and feelings, experiences that our culture in general doesn't really like. We tend to kind of push it away. If somebody calls and says, I'm having a tough time or I'm really sad, how often do you hear, well, come on, cheer up, things are going to get better? Or even kind of a subtle message of, oh, you're not feeling great today, you're kind of down in the dumps. Let me come over, and not during the pandemic, but typically like, let's meet up and I'll take you for a drink, or we'll go for coffee and we'll talk about good times, right? Like there's kind of this subtle insinuation of like, we don't want to talk too much. It's too scary for other people sometimes to really talk about grief and loss. So a lot of times there's kind of this collusion of people to kind of move us along to have us feel better. So I think it's interesting to notice and think about that change actually always involves loss. So whether we've grieved a death of somebody, we've actually have all grieved before. And it might be small things. And I mean, these don't have to be small either, but maybe we have grieved a death, but maybe it's been, maybe we've had a death of a pet, or actually a kind of a loss actually can be graduation from high school. Yes, it can be celebratory, but it's the end of a chapter for many of us. So we're saying goodbye, we're closing. It's the loss of that social support and structure and time in our lives. As the video mentioned, maybe it was a job loss or a change even. For others, it can be impairment or illness. When we go through transitions, we are, as often as we start a new chapter, we're also kind of closing a chapter. And so I do think too, just to acknowledge that grief I don't like to say it goes away, because a lot of times people hold grief with them or loss with them and hold it with them as a way to honor it. but it does change and it does subside and it takes a different shape, and a lot of times it can soften. So when we think about grief, there's kind of two big categories that we think about. First one is this physical or actual loss. And this, again, this might be the death of somebody, a person who we loved or cared about. It might be the loss of a job, or income. For a lot of younger people right now, it's dealing with the loss of things that they planned for, like graduation and proms. I've heard some discussions recently of people who are summer camp people, and the loss of going to summer camp. But then we also have these symbolic losses that are just as important, but sometimes we don't acknowledge as much. But a loss for future plans. I work with people with cancer, and a lot of times when I'm working with families, after a partner dies, one of the losses that a partner has to deal with is the loss of, I thought we had our retirement together. I thought we were going to do X, Y, or Z together. And so this loss of future. And I know a lot of that's happening with the pandemic right now, of the loss of, we had plans for the summer. We had plans next year. So again, it can be a symbolic loss of like hopes for retirement, a sense of accomplishment, of getting something done, finishing something. I know the video mentioned, a loss of like safety right now. That's a big loss. And I just think about the ease of living. Like we just took a lot for granted and things were kind of easy. And now there's so many things that we have to think about. We have to restructure. There's a loss there. I also want to point out that grieving is actually really hard work. And sometimes, a lot of times I work with people don't really, it's not something we talk about, but grieving actually, there's clear literature to show it really makes us more tired. So energy, more physically tired. There was a big article that came out, I can't remember if it was the Washington Post or somewhere, right kind of at the beginning of the pandemic. And the title was something like, I'm feeling discomfort. Oh wait, that's like loss and grief. And it was kind of the first time I saw it in the press kind of acknowledge that that's what it was. And they talked about just feeling this weight in their body. We do see, and there's been lots of discussion, I think for many reasons, but around sleep being disrupted, worry, different schedules and things like that, but also that this is taking a toll on us. When people grieve, so again, whether it's a person or some other loss, they're actually more prone to accidents. So there's more falls and trips, more minor vehicle crashes, things like that. So I'm constantly telling people, just bring a little more attention just to the daily tasks. You're going to have to work a little harder to be more present. And then also we can see more irritability. So while it is hard work, grieving actually is work also. And what we're working is to try not to avoid. It's kind of like Jack talked about, not avoiding fear. Here we're really trying to not avoid the feelings of whether it's loss or sadness, whatever the feelings are underneath that. But we want to acknowledge and to accommodate. When we think about accommodate in an emotional, psychological sense, we're really talking about making room for. And in the video, they talked about acknowledge, that kind of name and claim. Jack talked about it in words I would use too, of just to notice. So Russ Harris he writes really beautifully in a really accessible way. And he talks about this, and this can be any sort of feelings that aren't excited to have. But opening up and making room for painful feelings, urges, and emotions. I would also add in their memories. We drop the struggle with them. We give them some breathing space, and we allow them to be just as they are. Instead of fighting them, resisting them, running from them, or getting overwhelmed by them, we open up to them and we let them be. And importantly, this doesn't mean liking them or wanting them. It simply means making room for them. We turn towards, we lean in, we open up, we acknowledge, and I always talk about kind of holding it. So ideas for how to grieve, once we start kind of putting language to this and kind of noticing. So the video also talked about a really important thing is most of us are pretty resilient. We've coped with challenges and struggles in the past. And one of the best things we can do, a lot of times people flounder and feel overwhelmed. And a lot of times what I'm doing is helping normalize, slow them down, and really start kind of digging, what have you done in the past? When you encountered something tough before, how did you manage that? Who did you turn to? What did you do? How did you cope? And typically, they're kind of surprised when we end up with a list of things that they either already done that they've neglected, or people they've turned to, resources they've tapped before. So really asking, what have you done in the past, and what do you already do to cope? And a lot of times during kind of a turbulent time or a stressful time, a lot of people's coping can go by the wayside. So a lot of times this is coming back to really what we know works. For me, sometimes I notice if my irritability or my agitation gets up, it's a really good, I'll start noticing it's kind of building. And one of my big things is just reading fiction. Like that's a really wonderful thing for me to do. And even if my partner notices, like I'm more irritable, they'll say like, hey, what are you reading these days? Like, hey, how about some time to read a book? Like even just something as basic for that. Like I know for me to have a good morning walk, to read some fiction, you know, those are really basic things. But when things get turbulent, those can go out the window. So even going back to some of the basics. Another big one, and it relates to my previous slide before this, but is sleep. I cannot emphasize enough how much getting a good night's sleep. And that I probably would guess Rebecca and Jack would agree, but like that really helps manage family time. Talking about worry, geez, when there's really clear research that when we don't get good night's sleep, most of we tend to feel more irritable in general. So sleep helps us and also helps us grieve. So, but just also some suggestions, notice feelings, just to name them, to acknowledge them, and to acknowledge the discomfort, name and claim those feelings. And maybe it is sadness, maybe it's fear, maybe it's anger, maybe it's loss, whatever that feeling is. Create a small ritual. That might be lighting a small candle. If it's a person, maybe that means wearing a piece of jewelry or a tie they had. Maybe that means I sometimes have kept a basket, and when I lose somebody, I just have small pieces of paper and I write one word of something that symbolizes them, and I just sit and meditate for a minute, and I put that in my basket. And I have a basket that I've done this for years. That's my small ritual. So it depends on what it is, but it may be driving a specific way and noticing, maybe it's the cardinals have a kind of a representation for a lot of people, also just about meaning and loss. Maybe it's noticing this tree where cardinals once were, whatever it is, but it kind of dovetails. Spending time in nature is a really good antidote. Journal or writing. There's research to show that we organize our thoughts differently when we write. And so to write or to journal, it doesn't have to be profound or fancy. It's just writing. Of course, praying or meditating can be a way to symbolize and to connect, but also to be really present. And then also just a theme that's gone through each of our talks is the importance of connecting with others. One of the best things we can do is maintaining social support. And I've noticed, and it's consistent with research, but is just verbalizing, not only name and claim for yourself, but say to somebody else, I'm really bummed out that I know there's a lot of suffering and a lot of things are happening and we haven't lost somebody personally, but I'm just bummed at how much our summers are going to look different. It's a disappointment. Things could be better or could be much worse, but I'm disappointed that this is happening right now. And then lastly, I'll wrap up here, but another thing just to mention, this is a whole bigger area, but I think it's important to think about how we make meaning and grow from loss. Because one of the things it's kind of a human task is we look for meaning in experiences. And we do the same thing with loss and grief. And so we have to kind of understand, how did this happen? You know, why is this happening? What does it really mean? And this, as much as we may not want the loss, whether it's graduation or prom or, you know, a loss of a loved one, it does have an opportunity to kind of change our perspective, open us up to exploring what's important to us. And so there is a potential. I think one thing we have to really, really careful is that we don't put pressure on people to have to find this, but I guess I mentioned it just to be aware that it's a possibility. And it's not a surprise, right? Like, we can be changed by our experiences, and that's really what this is. But I have heard people talking about, and you know, even with COVID, that people are noticing, you know, just how much they value connection with others. When we've had to restrict, people notice how important that is. I've heard a lot of families talk about just appreciating the slower pace, what wasn't really needed in the hustle and bustle of everything. I've heard a lot of other people talk also about just this appreciation and focus on the environment, how we realize that things are very fragile and that we have opportunities to make change. And just this acknowledgement, you know, I think many of us took for granted how interconnected we were, you know, whether that's on a personal level, at a community level, how much we impact each other. And so there is this potential for what we call post-traumatic growth, for growth and change out of something that has been really hard. And again, I don't say it that that somebody has to do this. We would never pick a trauma or a challenge or a loss or a grief to do this. But if this is already happening, there can be this growth out of what's going to happen, what comes out of it. And finally, I just wanted to leave you with a few resources if you're looking to do more reading. Again, you can Google the American Psychological Association. They have a lot of topics around anxiety and depression and families and things like that about COVID-19. There's a book and also a podcast called Mindfulness and Grief by Heather Stang. Joanne Cacciatore is a professor at Arizona State University and wrote a recent book that's beautiful, Bearing the Unbearable. David Kessler is a big grief expert around the world, and has a website and also a lot of resources. Also, he recently did a podcast with Brene Brown, who many people know and love, about grief and meaning. And then just to mention, Tayeb Rashid is a Canadian and has a beautiful, I couldn't get a PDF of it, but has a beautiful list of 101 ways to connect from a distance. And this is kind of related to like what Jack said about actions that we can do to live our values. And that's important to do when grieving. And then also just 2 other book suggestions that are there on the right-hand side. Thank you.
All right, thank you, all of you. That was wonderful. I know we're out of time. Are all of you okay with spending maybe 10, 15 minutes answering questions?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
And Rebecca, you need to unmute yourself.
I'm here.
Wonderful.
One question that we got is, what do you do when you just can't get out of an isolated depression because of quarantine?
That's a good question.
It is a good question.
If you can't get out of an isolated depression, is that what the
Yeah, that's
phrasing
what
of
they
it?
said. Yeah.
Do you want to take your check?
I'll take a stab, but I would encourage you to also break in and share your thoughts. So one of the things that we know to be one of the most helpful things with depression is to engage, which is also one of the hardest things to do when you're depressing. Full acknowledgement of that, is to engage in behaviors that are positively reinforcing, to be able to get out and do the things that we previously found meaningful. And in the time of COVID, that's incredibly difficult. But another really helpful way of viewing this is that it's important to do positively reinforcing things, but it's also important to do things that are in line with our values. And I think we can still find ways of doing things that are in line with our values. I think that we can still, and because brief clinical thing, because we're the only species who can actually be positively reinforced by symbolic, like meaning things, like because I'm doing this thing because being present with people is important to me. And like values, we're the only species that can be positively reinforced by values because it's like this language-based symbolic thing. So being able to, sorry for the nerd out, so being able to figure out what are the things that I stand for in life, and who do I want to be, and can I, in the ways that make sense for me right now, given the limitations of my ability, I can't get out maybe and play tennis like I'd like to, but can I still choose in any given moment to kind of live those values? I feel like this is not a really full answer because I still feel like it's it, but I think that's the limitation of like the time. I think it's because, but you know, there's still so much we can't do. Amanda, and Rebecca, I just know, Amanda, you were going to say something a minute ago, but do you guys have anything to add to that? Because it's a great question and it's hard. And also it's important to be nice to yourself and acknowledge that, you know, it's hard. Like Rebecca said, it's hard because this is hard. And so to be able to say, I'm suffering, so let me acknowledge this is suffering and let me be kind to myself about that. So.
Yeah, Rebecca, okay, I'll jump in and then feel free. You know, I think that there is, I think there's something really important, again, about this naming and claiming and acknowledging. I mean, we're seeing really higher rates, increasing rates of mental health issues just because of this situation. And my guess is that that might increase among some people over the next few months. So, you know, acknowledging that there's something, that you're in this with other people, that you're not actually isolated, that this is a common experience, and trying possibly to find ways to connect, whether it's online, you know, with a therapist. There are some resources in the city, even around here, phone numbers that people can call, and but connecting with others, because this is not unusual. It's more about how do we help. And so I think, you know, acknowledging, connecting with others, basic things are important right now too, of, you know, getting enough sleep. Just like Rebecca talked about a schedule, one of the best things for people when they fall into a depression is having a schedule and scheduling in things. And your mind is going to try to get in your way and say, like, it doesn't matter. I mean, I always tell my clients, the couch is not your friend. The bed is not your friend. I want you, I know it's tough, but I want you showered and I want you dressed and I want you outside. Even if it's for 10 minutes sitting on your front porch or 2 minutes sitting on the back. You know, usually I try to get people out somewhere every day. That's not a good thing right now. So usually I'm telling people like a Target run or to the library or something out once a day. If you can just get outside, you know, away from so appropriately socially distanced, that's good. And even it's finding the small things, the behavior we may not be able to do, these big gestures, but it might be, you know, bird watching right now. There's actually been a skyrocketing increase of bird watching. And like how lovely. It might be tending to some plants, but finding these value-based behaviors that maybe beauty is important to you, maybe helping others is important to you. And there's actually a lot of research that doing things for others actually improves mood. So, you know, maybe it is writing letters or sending, you know, doing things for others, or finding something like that. I had something else. Then the other thing too of just, you know, sleep is good. We're also really seeing increased alcohol rates. So paying attention to poor coping as well. So, you know, really trying, this is not, as I was listening to another psychologist talk recently, and she's like, this is not the time to be increasing your drinking for any of us, you know? So paying attention what we put into our bodies, trying to nurture ourselves, and asking for help. Jack or Rebecca want to add anything to that?
I think just to kind of highlight there, I'll say, well, I don't mean to interrupt.
No, yeah.
I think one of the keys, one of the things that stuck out to me about the question was the framing of how do I get out? Mm-hmm. And I think that can feel like a really big task. Mm-hmm. And so the wonderful suggestions from Jack and from Amanda are wonderful because they are small. And so I think that one of the things, you know, this is long work, small steps. And so if when you're doing some of those things, you're asking yourself, did this get me out of my depression? Then that's probably not the right, that's hard. That's too big of a step. Right. But asking, I often think about this and talk about it with clients about just like the little tiny knobs on, you know, when you turn up the volume and you can feel that tiny little click, like we're just trying to turn things up or down, modulate in little bits, and taken all together after a bunch of those. That is real progress, and it's progress each step along the way. But it doesn't mean that if we do one of those things for a day, then we're good forever. It's hard work. It's hard work.
And I know too, well, let me just add real quick that I know that the three of us were shooting around some resources before this talk, and there are some lists if somebody's interested in like things that I can do that might just be simple, easy ideas to get a little bit more active. We have some access to that, and you can email any one of us, and we'd be
absolutely
more than happy to share that. And Mariah, I would share that also on my snaps. So don't call me based on the number, because my snapshot slide at the beginning, I actually gave my personal phone number. I didn't realize I did that instead of my business number. So just email me based on my website if anybody
contacts me. What's your email, Jack? Because I know you have
Jack,
a resource.
Yeah, jack@cooperative.therapy.com. I'm sure So.
Perfect. Yeah, you have a really good resource particularly for people who are in a depression.
I do, but the one that you sent as well, that you shared, I thought was really good as well. So
yeah, that 101 ways. Yeah.
So feel free, email me if anybody, I've got like an Excel spreadsheet, and it says, if you're interested in connection, you hit this tab and it gives ideas for connection. If you're interested in exercise, and things that you can specifically do during this time. So I'll be quiet now. Mariah, you ask another question.
No, you're fine. I think probably two more questions before we wrap things up. One, I think this is pretty good after just the previous question. When is it time to get professional help with anxiety, grief, or family issues?
I think that is that's such a sort of case-by-case call. There's no one answer to that. I think fortunately, there's no bad call you could make on this, right? Because if you decide, no, now's not the time, the option doesn't go away. And if you decide, yeah, now's the time, and you give it a shot and it turns out that, you were doing pretty well, then that works out pretty good too. When I'm talking to families who are sort of new to me, I usually try to put the question back and say, does this feel like it's too hard? Do you feel like the things that you have to talk to me about are preventing you from living like sort of your normal day-to-day life, which of course now we have to put in the context of what my understanding of a normal sort of pandemic life is. And that's a tough question to answer. So I think I'm probably not speaking just for myself when I say that I have lots of really long like consult calls with people who call me with that very question. Should I come see you? And that's something that I think most therapists are able to kind of hash out a little bit in that intake call. But it's okay for you to just decide, this is a lot. I need some help. You're not going to be alone in that. And trust yourself in that way.
Jack, do you have anything you want to add?
I don't think I have a ton to add to that. I mean, I think I agree. It's a very case-by-case basis. And I mean, I think that, like we can't like give advice on specific cases like we mentioned in this presentation, but it's almost like part of me is like, well, tell me what it would be about, and then I could give you an answer. But this isn't the venue for that. So I think Rebecca gave a great answer.
And I'll just add one thing. I think, I think two things. I think a lot of things, but let me say two. One is, I think, kind of like what Rebecca alluded to, there's actually a lot of work, even if things aren't desperate or dire, that we can do to kind of help enhance well-being and even kind of corral resilience. And so a lot of times, you know, people may have 3 to 5 sessions with me just to make sure that they're kind of like their muscles are a little bit stronger, and a lot of times they need things normalized. They need clarity. They need to just talk it out with somebody outside of their family or their faith community, or so short is fine. So I think there's a lot of positive psychology stuff we can do. But then when it comes to distress or challenge, I would also add, I agree with everything that's been said, but I would also add that if there's a domain in your life that seems like it's affected, so if you're just keep getting in fights with the people you work with, or, you know, it's been really rocky with your partner for the last 6 months, or, you know, your mood really has been down for more than 2 weeks, and that's either unusual for you, or this is a pattern you know isn't good for you, and your normal kind of typical coping isn't working, then I would definitely say, you know, reach out, just because I think that the piece that makes me sad sometimes is people's unnecessary suffering. You know, I'll see people who say like, I've struggled with this for 10 years. And it's, you know, that's kind of heartbreaking to me. I think everybody kind of chooses the time and the resources and what they need at that time. But to think that, wow, you've been struggling with this for, I mean, I've seen people struggle with something for 70 years and then come in when they're 85 and, you know, we'll work on something. But I just think sometimes reaching out and asking for support, you know, we can get that and then move on.
Okay, next question. At what point do cleaning and mitigation strategies become problematic? Is there such thing as too much?
That's a good question. Yeah, so I'll lead off on that one, since that's like kind of my thing. So yeah, cleaning and mitigation strategies. I think that really comes down again to noticing the function of why we're doing the behavior we're engaging in. So we're like the why. I keep saying words like function, but the why of why we're cleaning. I think that there's been a lot of talk lately about, you know, like we should all be like, you know, cleaning a whole lot, like, I believe like Howie Mandel did an interview, and I think the interviewer said like, well, you've had it right all along, and like we should have all been doing, you know, like cleaning and minimizing touch and all of those things. And so I think we have to just be really careful about the fact that mitigation strategies, or, you know, trying to mitigate the spread of virus, can in and of itself become really problematic, and then can take on and begin to feed itself, and can become like compulsive behaviors that then feed into more and more of that same thing. So for me, it really comes down to, since right now we have to clean, it really comes down to noticing the why. And I have a colleague in the OCD world who actually just created this really cool spreadsheet for a client, because they couldn't stop washing, and they had compulsions around washing. And so it was just like, just write in the check, I'm doing this for OCD, or I'm doing this for CDC. And so for people who don't have OCD, I would say, just notice, I'm doing this out of fear, or I'm doing this because of my values. And then if you are washing your hands for 20 seconds, you're fine. If you go to 21 seconds, it's way too much. Stop. No, just like, you know, notice if you haven't left the house and you haven't touched packages from outside, and then you're washing your hands because out of fear or a thought about, you know, coronavirus, but you've had no contact with anything outside of the house, then that's a reason to say like, what's going on here? So.
And I feel it's been interesting, even as a parent, I feel like, well, that's one of the things I've had to help my kids do, right? Is to talk about the why we're doing it. And it really linking it back into our values of like, we're doing this because we care about, like, it's important for ourselves to be safe. It's important that we take care of our family. It's important that, you know, we wear masks outside because we care about others. But, you know, their little minds at the beginning were, you know, we have to, and should we always be, and, you know, helping that come back to, well, what is the function? So I've been talking a lot about them with the function. Why do we do this? And what does that look like? So whether it's for me or for them, or a bit of both.
I like that. And then I'm sure that Rebecca, like, I'd be curious about that too. Like
Yeah.
you know, how do we model how like,
Yeah.
you know, what's our emotion coming out as we're doing it, and how are they picking up on that? I bet you could say.
Yeah. So I'm so glad you guys raised those questions for me. Key it up. So a couple things. So I think I spoke a lot about the importance of sort of role modeling as a parent, and that really is very influential on your kid, regardless of their age. And so if you notice you're engaging in worry, and you are jumping like, wash your hands, you know, this sends a signal to your child that something really scary has happened. And so that's generally, we want to try to work on kind of calming ourselves down while also setting the appropriate limit that we want to set. But I think to Amanda's point also about how are we framing to kids about why we're doing what we're doing is really important. And this is one of my favorite things to talk about, which is especially with young kids, it's really important to be talking about different kinds of germs and viruses. And that one of the reasons that we're doing things so different right now because of this sickness is because it's a different kind of sickness, and it's a new kind of sickness. And we do not need to do these things the next time someone has strep throat. We do not need to do these things the next time somebody has allergies. That there are good germs, there are bad germs, there are most sicknesses have been around for a long time. This one's really new, and so we have to do things really differently, because the sort of cautious sort of framing of that comes from the anticipation that kids draw conclusions in their minds without telling us. I mean, we all do this, but kids do it extra, and we have a bigger role in influencing them. And we don't want them to link this pandemic to a normal response to every other sickness.
Those are great points, Rebecca.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah.
I'm going to send my kid to you for therapy.
Okay, great.
Okay, that is all the time we have. Thank you, all three of you, for giving such great and informative presentations. And everyone stay safe out there and take care of yourselves.
Yes.
Thank you, Mariah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.